And the pathless forest that still covered this wild principality should give place, as it inevitably must, though perhaps not till ages hence, to the golden fertility of human culture. It would be the source of incalculable wealth to the Pyncheon blood. Had the colonel survived only a few weeks longer, it is probable that his greatest political influence and powerful connections at home and abroad would have consummated all that was necessary to render the claim available. But in spite of good Mr. Higginson's congratulatory eloquence, this appeared to be the one thing which Colonel Pyncheon, provident and sagacious as he was, had allowed to go at loose ends. So far as the prospective territory was concerned, he unquestionably died too soon. His son lacked not merely the father's eminent position, but the talent and force of character to achieve it. He could therefore effect nothing by dint of political interest, and the bare justice or legality of the claim was not so apparent after the colonel's decease as it had been pronounced in his lifetime. Some connecting link had slipped out of the evidence and could not anywhere be found. Efforts, it is true, were made by the Pyncheons, not only then, but at various periods for nearly 100 years afterwards, to obtain what they so stubbornly persisted in deeming their right. But in course of time, the territory was partly regranted to more favored individuals, and partly cleared and occupied by actual settlers. These last, if they ever heard of the Pyncheon title, would have laughed at the idea of any man's asserting a right, or in the strength of mouldy parchments signed with the faded autographs of governors and legislators long dead and forgotten, to the lands which they or their fathers had wrested for the wild hand of nature by their own sturdy toil. This impalpable claim, therefore, resulted in nothing more solid than to cherish from generation to generation an absurd delusion of family importance, which all along characterized the Pyncheons. It caused the poorest member of the race to feel as if he inherited a kind of nobility, and might yet come into the possession of princely wealth to support it. In the better specimens of the breed, this peculiarity threw an ideal grace over the hard material of human life without stealing away any truly valuable quality. In the baser sort, its effect was to increase the liability of sluggishness and dependence, and induce the victim of a shadowy type to remit all self-effort, while awaiting the realization of his dreams. Years and years after the claim had passed out of the public memory, the Pyncheons were accustomed to consult the colonel's ancient map, which was projected while Waldo County was still an unbroken wilderness. Where the old land surveyor had put down woods, lakes, and rivers, they marked out and cleared down woods, lakes, and rivers, and marked out the cleared spaces, and dotted the villages and towns, and calculated the progressively increasing value of the territory, as if there were yet a prospect of its ultimately forming a princedom for themselves. In almost every generation, nevertheless, there happened to be some one descendant of the family gifted with a portion of the land, keen sense, and practical energy that so remarkably distinguished the original founder. His character, indeed, might be traced all the way down, as distinctly as if the colonel himself, a little deluded, had been gifted with a sort of intermittent immortality on earth. At 2 or 3 epochs, when the fortunes of the family were low, this representative of hereditary qualities had made his appearance, and caused the traditionary gossips of the town to whisper among themselves, "Here is the old Pyncheon come again. Now the 7 Gables will be new-shingled." From father to son they clung to the ancestral house with singular tenacity of home attachment. For various reasons, however, and from impressions often too vaguely founded to be put on paper, the writer cherishes the belief that many, if not of the successive proprietors of the estate, were troubled with doubts as to their moral right to hold it. Of their legal tenure there can be no question, but old Matthew Malt, it is to be feared, trod downward from his own age to a far later one, planting a heavy footstep all the way on the conscience of a Pyncheon. If so, we are left to dispose of the awful query, whether each inheritor of the property, conscious of wrong and failing to rectify it, did commit anew the great guilt of his ancestor and incur all its original responsibilities. And supposing such to be the case, would it not be a far truer mode of expression to say the Pyncheon family that they inherited a great misfortune than the reverse? We have already hinted that it is not our purpose to trace down the history of the Pyncheon family and its unbroken connection with the house of 7 Gables, nor to show as an imagined picture how the rustiness and infirmity of age gathered over the venerable house itself. As regards its interior life, a large dim-looking glass used to hang in one of the rooms, and was fabled to contain within its depths all the shapes that had ever been reflected there, the old colonel himself and his many descendants, some of the garb of antique babyhood, and others in the bloom of feminine beauty or manly prime, or saddened with the wrinkles of rusty age. Had we the secret of that mirror, we would gladly sit down before it and transfer its revelations to our page. But there is a story for which it is difficult to conceive any foundation, that the posterity of Matthew Maule had some connection with the mystery of the looking-glass, and that by what appears to have been a sort of mesmeric process, they could make its inner region all alive with their departed pensions, not as they had shown themselves to the world, or in their better and happier hours, but as doing over again in some deed of sin, or in the crisis of life's bitterest sorrow. The popular imagination, indeed, long kept itself busy with the affair of the old Puritan pension, and the wizard Maule, the curse of which the latter flung from his scaffold, and remembered, with the very important addition that it had become a part of the pension inheritance. If one of the family did but gurgle in his throat, a bystander would be likely enough to whisper between jest and earnest, "He has Maule's blood to drink." The sudden death of a pension about 100 years ago, with circumstances very similar to what has been related of the colonel's exit, was held as giving additional probability to the received opinion on this topic. It was considered, moreover, an ugly and ominous circumstance that Colonel Pynchon's picture, in obedience, it was said, to a provision of his will, remained affixed to the wall of the room in which he died. Those stern, immitigable features seemed to symbolize an evil influence, and so darkly to mingle the shadow of their presence with the sunshine of the passing hour, that no good thoughts or purposes could ever spring up and blossom there. To the thoughtful mind there will be no tinge of superstition in what we figuratively express by affirming that the ghost of the dead progenitor, perhaps as a portion of his own punishment, is often doomed to become the evil genius of his family. The Pynchons, in brief, lived long for the better part of 2 centuries, with perhaps less of forward vicissitude than has attended most other New England families during the same period of time. Possessing very distinctive traits of their own, they nevertheless took the general characteristics of the little community in which they dwelt, a town noted for its frugal, discreet, well-ordered, and home-loving inhabitants, as well as for the somewhat confined scope of its sympathies, but in which, be it said, there are odder individuals, and now and then stranger occurrences than one meets with almost anywhere else. During the Revolution, the pension of that epoch, adopting the royal side, became a refugee, but repented, and made his reappearance just at the point of time to preserve the house of Seven Gables from confiscation. For the last 70 years, the most noted event in the pension annals had been likewise the heaviest calamity that ever befell the race, no less than the violent death, for so it was adjudged, of one member of the family by the criminal act of another. Certain circumstances attending this fatal occurrence had brought the deed irresistibly home to a nephew of the deceased pension. The young man was tried and convicted of the crime, but either the circumstantial nature of the evidence, and possibly some lurking doubt in the breast of the executive, or lastly, an argument of greater weight in a republic than it could have been under a monarchy, the high respectability and political influence of the criminal's connections had availed to mitigate his doom from death to perpetual imprisonment. This sad affair had chanced about 30 years before the action of our story commences. Latterly, there were rumors which few believed, and only 1 or 2 felt greatly interested in, that this long-buried man was likely, for some reason or other, to be summoned forth from his living tomb. It is essential to say a few words respecting the victim of this now almost forgotten murder. He was an old bachelor, and possessed of great wealth, in addition to the house and real estate which constituted what remained of the ancient pension property. Being of an eccentric and melancholy turn of mind, and greatly given to rummaging old records and hearkening to old traditions, he had brought himself, it is averred, to the conclusion that Matthew Maule, the wizard, had been foully wronged out of his homestead, if not out of his life. Such being the case, and he, the old bachelor, in possession of ill-gotten spoil, with the black stain of blood sunken deep into it, and still to be scented with by conscientious nostrils, the question occurred whether it were not imperative upon him, even at this late hour, to make restitution to Maule's posterity. To a man living so much in the past and so little in the present, as the secluded and antiquarian old bachelor, a century and a half seemed not so vast a period as to obviate the propriety of substituting right for wrong. It was the belief of those who knew him best that he would positively have taken a very singular step of having given up the house of Seven Gables to the representative of Matthew Maule, but for the unspeakable tumult with a suspicion of the old gentleman's project awakened among his pension relatives. Their exertions had the effect of suspending his purpose, but it was feared that he would perform after death, by the operation of his last will, what he had so hardly been prevented from doing in his proper lifetime. But there is no one thing which men so rarely do, whatever the provocation or inducement, as to bequeath patrimonial property away from their own blood. They may love other individuals far better than their relatives. They may even cherish dislike or positive hatred to the latter, but yet in view of death, the strong prejudice of the propinquity revives and impels the testator to send down his estate in the line marked out by custom so immemorial that it looks like nature. In all the pensions, this feeling had the energy of disease. It was too powerful for the conscientious scruples of the old bachelor, at whose death, accordingly, the mansion house, together with the most of his other riches, passed into the possession of his next legal representative. This was a nephew, the cousin of the miserable young man who had been convicted of the uncle's murder. The new heir, up to the period of his accession, was reckoned rather than a dissipated youth, but had at once reformed and made himself an exceedingly respectable member of society. In fact, he showed more of the pension quality, and had won higher eminence in the world than any of his race since the time of their original Puritan. Applying himself in earlier manhood to the study of the law, and having a natural tendency toward office, he had attained many years ago to a judicial situation in some inferior court, which gave him for life the very desirable and imposing title of judge. Later he had engaged in politics, and served a part of 2 terms in Congress, besides making a considerable figure in both branches of the state legislature. Judge Pynchon was unquestionably an honor to his race. He had built himself a country seat within a few miles of his native town, and there spent such portions of his time as could be spared from public service in the display of every grace and virtue, as a newspaper phrased it on the eve of an election, befitting the Christian, the good citizen, the horticulturist, and the gentleman. There were few of the pensions left to sun themselves in the glow of the judge's prosperity. In respect to natural increase, the breed had not yet thriven. It appeared rather to be dying out. The only members of the family known to be extant were, first, the judge himself, and a single surviving son, who is now traveling in Europe. Next, the 30 years prisoner already alluded to, and a sister on the latter, who occupied in extremely retired manner the house of 7 Gables, in which she had a life estate by the will of the old bachelor. She was understood to be wretchedly poor, and seemed to make it her choice to remain so, inasmuch as her affluent cousin, the judge, had repeatedly offered her all the comforts of life, either in the old mansion or his own modern residence. The last and youngest pension was a little country girl of 17, the daughter of another of the judge's cousins, who had married a young woman of no family or property, and died early in poor circumstances. His widow had recently taken another husband. As for Matthew Maule's posterity, it was supposed now to be extinct. For a very long period after the witchcraft delusion, however, the Maules had continued to inhabit the town where the progenitor had suffered so unjust a death. To all appearance they were a quiet, honest, well-meaning race of people, cherishing no malice against individuals or the public for the wrong which had been done them. Or if at their own fireside they transmitted from father to child any hostile recollection of the wizard's fate, and to their lost patrimony, it was never acted upon nor openly expressed, nor would it have been singular had they ceased to remember that the house of 7 Gables was resting its heavy framework on a foundation that was rightfully their own. There was something so massive, stable, and almost irresistibly imposing in the exterior presentment of established rank and great possessions, for their very existence seems to give them a right to exist, at least so excellent a counterfeit of right, that few poor and humble men have moral force enough to question it, even in their secret minds. Such is the case now, after so many ancient prejudices have been overthrown, and it was far more so in anti-revolutionary days, when the aristocracy could venture to be proud, and the low were content to be abased. Thus the Maules, at all events, kept their resentments within their own breasts. They were generally poverty-stricken, always plebeian and obscure, working with unsuccessful diligence at their handicrafts, laboring on the wharves, or following the sea as sailors before the mast, living here and there about the town, in hired tenements, and coming finally to the almshouse as the natural home of their old age. At last, after creeping, as it were, for such a length of time, along the utmost verge of the opaque puddle of obscurity, they had taken that downright plunge, where sooner or later is the destiny of all families, whether princely or plebeian. For 30 years past, neither town record nor gravestone nor the directory, nor the knowledge or memory of man, bore any trace of Matthew Mall's descendants. His blood might possibly exist elsewhere, here where its lowly current could be traced so far back it had ceased to keep an outward course. So long as any of the race were to be found, they had been marked out from other men, not strikingly nor as with sharp line, but with an effect that was felt rather than spoken of by an hereditary character of reserve. Their companions, or those who endeavored to become such, grew conscious of a circle around the Malls, within the sanctity or the spell of which, in spite of an exterior of sufficient frankness and good fellowship, it was impossible for any man to step. It was this indefinable peculiarity, perhaps, that by insulating them from human aid kept them always so unfortunate in life. It certainly operated to prolong in their case, and to conform them as their only inheritance those feelings of repugnance and superstitious terror with which the people of the town, even after awakening from their frenzy, continued to regard the memory of the reputed witches. The mantle, or rather the ragged cloak, of old Matthew Mall had fallen upon his children. They were half believed to inherit mysterious attributes. The family eye was said to possess strange power. Among other good-for-nothing properties and privileges, one was especially assigned to them, that of exercising an influence over people's dreams. The pensions, if all stories were true, haughtily as they bore themselves in the noonday streets of their native town, were no better than bond-servants to these plebeian Malls, or entering the topsy-turvy of commonwealth of sleep. Modern psychology, it may be, will endeavor to reduce these alleged necromancies within a system, instead of rejecting them as altogether fabulous. A descriptive paragraph or two treating the seven-gabled mansion and its more recent aspect will bring this preliminary chapter to a close. The street in which it upreared its venerable peaks has long ceased to be a fashionable quarter of the town, so that though an old edifice was surrounded by habitations of modern date, they were mostly small, built entirely of wood, and typical of the most plodding uniformity of common life. Doubtless, however, the whole story of human existence may be latent in each of them, but with no picturesqueness externally that can attract the imagination or sympathy to seek it there. But as for the old structure of our story, its white oak frame, its boards, shingles, and crumbling plaster, and even the huge clustered chimney in the midst, seemed to constitute only the least and meanest part of its reality. So much of mankind's varied experience had passed there. So much had been suffered, and something, too, enjoyed, that the very timbers were oozy, as with the moisture of a heart. It was itself like a great human heart, with a life of its own and full of rich and somber reminiscences. The deep projection of the second story gave the house such a meditative look that you could not pass it without the idea that it had secrets to keep, and an eventful history to moralize upon. In front, just on the edge of the unpaved sidewalk, grew the pension elm, which, in reference to such trees as one usually meets with, might well be termed gigantic. It had been planted by a great-grandson of the first pension, and though now 80 years of age, and perhaps nearer 100, was still in its strong and broad maturity, throwing its shadows from side to side of the street, overtopping the seven gables, and sweeping the whole black roof with its pendant foliage. It gave beauty to the old edifice, and seemed to make it a part of all nature. The street having been widened about 40 years ago, the front gable was now precisely on a line with it. On either side extended a ruinous wooden fence of open latticework, through which could be seen a grassy yard, and especially in the angles of the building, an enormous fertility of burdocks with leaves, it is hardly an exaggeration to say 2 or 3 feet long. Behind the house there appeared to be a garden, which undoubtedly had once been extensive, but was now infringed upon by other enclosures, or shut in by habitations or outbuildings that stood on another street. It would be an omission, trifling indeed, but unpardonable, were we to forget the green moss that had long since gathered over the projections of the windows and on the shops of the roof, nor must we fail to direct the reader's eye to a crop, not of weeds, but flower shrubs, which were growing aloft in the air, not a great way from the chimney, in the nook between 2 of the gables. They were called Alice's posies. The tradition was that a certain Alice Pynchon had flung up the seeds in sport, and that in the dust of the street and decay of the roof gradually formed a kind of soil for them, out of which they grew, and when Alice had long been in her grave. However the flowers might have come there, it was both sad and sweet to observe how nature adapted herself to this desolate, decaying, gusty, rusty old house of the Pyncheon family, and how the ever-returning summer did her best to gladden it with tender beauty, and grew melancholy in the effort. There is one other feature very essential to be noticed, but which we greatly fear may damage any picturesque and romantic impression which we have been willing to throw over our sketch. This respectable edifice, in the front gable, under the impending brow of the second story, contiguous to the street, was a shop door, divided horizontally in the midst, with a window for its upper segment, such as is often seen in dwellings of a somewhat ancient date. This same shop door had been a subject of no slight mortification to the present occupant of the august Pyncheon house, as well as to some of her predecessors. The matter is disagreeably delicate to handle, but since the reader must needs be let into the secret, he will please to understand that about a century ago the head of the Pyncheons found himself involved in serious financial difficulties. The fellow gentleman, as he styled himself, can hardly have been other than a spurious interloper, for instead of seeking office from the king or the royal governor, or urging his hereditary claim to eastern lands, he bethought himself of no better avenue to wealth than by cutting a shop door through the side of his ancestral residence. It was the custom of the time, indeed, for merchants to store their goods and transact business in their own dwellings, but there was something pitifully small in this old Pyncheon's mode of setting about his commercial operations. It was whispered that, with his own hands all beruffled as they were, he used to give change for a shilling, and would turn a halfpenny twice over to make sure that it was a good one. Beyond all question, he had the blood of a petty huckster in his veins, through whatever channel it may have found its way there. Immediately on his death, the shop door had been locked, bolted, and barred, and down to the period of our story had probably never once been opened. The old counter, shelves, and other fixtures of the shop remained just as he had left them. It used to be affirmed that the dead shopkeeper, in a little wig, a faded velvet coat, and an apron at his waist, and his ruffles carefully turned back from his wrists, might be seen through the chinks of the shutters any night of the year, ransacking his till, or poring over the dingy pages of his day-book. For the look of an unutterable woe upon his face, it appeared to be his doom to spend eternity in a vain effort to make his accounts balance. And now, in a very humble way, as will be seen, we proceed to open our narrative.